The door of the farmhouse slammed shut with the flat, final sound of a coffin lid closing. Outside, the world was a scream of white. The wind came down from the mountains like a blade, shearing away warmth, hope, and the very memory of summer. It was 30 degrees below zero, a cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. Ilara stood on the porch, her husband's brother Silas framed for a moment in the window, his face a mask of grim satisfaction before he pulled the curtain closed. He had the farm now. He had the warmth. He had everything. In her arms, bundled in every layer she owned, was her son, Leo. 6 months old, a tiny, fragile weight against her chest. His life was a flickering candle flame, and Silas had just thrown them both into the heart of the storm. She looked down at what she had left in the world. The threadbare wool coat on her back, the worn boots on her feet, the sleeping child in her arms. In a small cloth sack were the only things Silas had allowed her: her husband's whittling knife, a tinder box, and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a deed. A cruel joke left by her father-in-law years ago, a deed to a 10-acre plot of useless, wind-swept rock 3 miles north of town. Its only feature was an old, dry well, long since abandoned. Clutched in her frozen hand were 4 silver dollars, the entirety of her worldly wealth. It was Silas's final act of charity, a pittance meant to buy her a ticket on the next stagecoach east, a way to be rid of her forever. The community of Providence Creek, huddled in their warm homes, had watched the quiet, brutal eviction unfold. They'd seen her stand at Silas's door, pleading, and they had turned away. A widow and her child were a burden, a reminder of the fragility of their own existence. Their pity was a cold, thin blanket, offering no real warmth. She walked into the wind, her body a shield for the precious bundle she carried. The town was a blur of frosted windows and smoke plumes rising from chimneys, each one a monument to a life that was no longer hers. She didn't go to the stagecoach office. She went to the Mercantile, the bell above the door jangling a feeble protest against the cold. Mr. Gable stood behind the counter, his face a mixture of pity and impatience. He expected her to beg. He expected tears. "A ticket east, Ilara?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "It's the only sensible thing." Ilara shook her head, the movement stiff with cold. She placed her 4 silver dollars on the worn wood of the counter. The coins looked small and inadequate. "I need a shovel," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "A good one. And an axe. 20 feet of rope, and a bucket." Gable stared at her, his jaw slack. He looked from the coins to the sleeping child in her arms, then back to her face, which was pale and set like granite. He saw no tears, no desperation, only a terrifying, unreadable resolve. The other men in the store, huddled around the pot-bellied stove, fell silent. They had all heard of the worthless land, of Silas's joke, the plot with the dead well. They thought she had gone mad with grief. "A shovel?" Gable repeated, dumbfounded. "Woman, what are you going to do with a shovel? Dig your own grave?" "The price," Ilara said, ignoring the question. Her gaze did not waver. Shaking his head, he calculated the cost. It took every coin she had, with just a few pennies to spare. He gathered the items, the heavy iron of the shovel head and the sharp steel of the axe, seeming impossibly brutal for her to carry. As she turned to leave, hoisting the tools, a hunter named Brant, known for his loud mouth and cruel jests, spoke from his warm seat by the fire. "Going to live in that hole in the ground, Ilara? You and the boy will be skeletons come the thaw." Ilara didn't look back. She pushed the door open, letting in another blast of Arctic air that made the men by the stove curse and shrink closer to the heat. She turned her back on the town, on its fleeting pity and its sharp-edged scorn. She adjusted the weight of the axe and shovel, settled the sleeping infant more securely against her heart, and began the long walk north into the teeth of the wind, toward a hole in the frozen ground. The journey was a battle against a merciless God. The wind was a physical force, a wall she had to break through with every step. It tore at her coat, found every tiny gap, and stabbed her with needles of ice. Snow, as fine and sharp as sand, blasted her face, crusting her eyelashes and freezing the tears to her cheeks before they could fall. The weight of the tools was a constant, dragging agony. The shovel handle dug into her shoulder, the axe a dead, cold weight in her hand. But the heaviest burden was the child. She hunched over him, her own body a desperate, failing barrier against the cold. Every few minutes she would stop, turn her back to the wind, and push her face inside the bundle of blankets, breathing her own warm air onto his tiny, still face. He slept on, oblivious, his life hanging by the thread of her endurance. The landscape was an empty, hostile canvas of white and gray. The trees were skeletal figures, clawing at a sky the color of lead. There was no sound but the howl of the wind and the crunch of her own boots in the snow. The 3 miles felt like 100. She finally reached the property line, marked by a single, gnarled oak that had long ago surrendered to the wind. Her land. It was worse than she had imagined. A barren, sloping hill, scoured clean of all but the most stubborn, frozen brush. And there, near the crest, was the well. It was not a quaint, storybook well. It was a jagged maw in the earth, a ring of dark, moss-covered stones circling a pit of blackness. It looked like the entrance to a tomb. Exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her legs trembled. Her arms screamed from the weight of the tools. She sank to her knees beside the stone ring, the hope that had fueled her journey guttering out like a cheap candle. Gable was right. Brant was right. The whole town was right. This wasn't a shelter. It was a grave waiting to be filled. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She looked at the accusing blackness of the well, and then at the precious bundle in her arms. She had brought her son here to die. She huddled against the stone lip of the well, trying to find a sliver of protection from the relentless wind. The stones were cold, but they broke the main force of the gale. As she pressed her face against the rough surface, sheltering Leo, she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air rising from the dark hole. She pulled back her glove and held her raw hand over the opening. The air coming out was not warm, not by any measure. But it was not the 30-below fury of the wind. It was still. It was damp. It was measurably, miraculously, less cold. A flicker of an idea, born of sheer desperation, ignited in her mind. Air was coming out. That meant air could get in. It was not a sealed tomb. She fumbled in her sack for the tinderbox. Her fingers were numb, clumsy claws, but she managed to strike a spark and light a sliver of tinder. She tied it to the end of a piece of twine from the sack and lowered the tiny, sputtering flame into the well. It descended, 10 feet, 20 feet, and did not go out. It flickered wildly in the draft, but it held. There was air down there. Good air. She leaned over and touched the stone lining inside the well shaft. It was cold, yes, but it was the steady, deep cold of the earth, not the killing frost of the surface. The ground itself, she realized, held a latent, neutral temperature. Below the frost line, the earth did not freeze. It was a massive, stable barrier against the savage fluctuations of the air above. The well was not a grave. It was a passage to a place the wind could not reach. The despair did not vanish, but it was joined by something new, a grim, ferocious resolve. She would not die here. She would dig. The first task was to create a seal against the storm. Using the axe, she hacked at the frozen branches of the stunted pines nearby. It was brutal work. The wood was like iron, and the axe handle stung her numb hands with every blow. She wove the branches into a crude lattice and laid it over the well opening. Over this, she draped the thickest of her blankets, weighing down the edges with heavy stones. It was a flimsy barrier, but it broke the wind and trapped the slightly less cold air rising from the depths. Section. Now, for the descent. She secured Leo first, rigging a sling that held him tightly to her chest, his face tucked inside her coat. She tied one end of the new rope to the gnarled oak tree and dropped the other into the darkness. Taking a deep breath of the freezing air, she slipped over the edge and began to lower herself into the earth. The well was about 30 feet deep, lined with rough-hewn stones for the first 20 feet, then giving way to packed, dark earth. The descent was terrifying. Her boots scrabbled for purchase on the slick, icy stones. The rope burned her raw hands. Below her was only blackness. When her feet finally touched the bottom, the silence was profound. The roar of the wind was gone, replaced by a muffled, distant howl, like a beast shut outside a heavy door. The air was cold and damp, smelling of stone and deep earth, but it was blessedly, absolutely still. She lit another piece of tinder. The bottom of the well was wider than the top, perhaps 8 feet across. The floor was damp clay and loose rock. There was no standing water. She had her shelter from the wind. Now she needed to make it a home. The true labor began. The well shaft was her entrance, her chimney, and her only source of light. A home could not be at the bottom of a 30-foot hole. It had to be beside it. She chose a section of the earthen wall and began to dig, using the sharp edge of her shovel. The ground was densely packed clay and stone, hardened by time. At first, she could only chip away small fragments. It was grueling, repetitive work that sent jolts of pain up her arms and into her shoulders. Her life found a new, harsh rhythm. Dig, loosen the earth, scoop the dirt into the bucket, climb the rope to the surface, her muscles screaming with the effort of pulling her own weight, plus the child strapped to her. Haul up the bucket of earth, dump it, descend again, repeat. Each bucketful represented a few more inches of precious space, a tiny victory against the unyielding earth. Blisters formed on her hands, broke and bled, callousing over into thick, tough pads. Her body, softened by a year of marriage and motherhood, hardened into something lean and sinewy. After days of this relentless toil, she had carved out a hollow, a shallow cave just big enough for her to lie down in, with Leo beside her. It was not a room, it was a den, a burrow. But it was out of the direct path of the cold air sinking down the well shaft. It was the first true home she had made. That night, huddled in the absolute darkness, listening to the soft breaths of her sleeping son and the distant moan of the wind, she did not feel triumphant. She felt only a profound, bone-deep weariness and the simple, animal satisfaction of being alive. The burrow grew. The small hollow became a room, 10 feet by 8, with a ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright. The clay she excavated was a gift. She learned to mix it with water from a slow, steady seep she discovered in the wall of the well shaft, creating a thick, natural plaster. She smoothed this over the rough earthen walls and ceiling, which stopped the crumbling and made the space feel more solid, more purposeful. She used flat stones dug from the earth to create a floor, raising it slightly above the damp ground. Water was life. The seep was a miracle. It trickled from a fissure between two of the foundation stones of the well, a constant, patient drip of clean, filtered water. She dug a small basin beneath it, a sump to collect the flow. Then, using more of her remarkable clay, she lined the basin, patting it smooth and firing it as best she could with a small, controlled fire. The result was a crude but effective cistern, a tiny, personal reservoir that held several gallons of fresh water, safe from the freezing temperatures above. But warmth was the most pressing need. A fire in an enclosed space was a death sentence, its smoke a silent killer. One day, while plastering the back wall of her chamber, she felt a draft. It was faint but unmistakable, a thin line of colder air. Tapping the wall, she heard a hollow sound. With renewed energy, she chipped away at the clay and discovered a narrow fissure in the rock behind it, a natural crack leading upwards into the deep earth of the hill. This was the key. She spent a week painstakingly widening the base of the fissure, using the head of the axe and a heavy rock as a hammer and chisel. It was the hardest work she had ever done. The stone was stubborn, but she was more so. Slowly, she carved out an opening large enough to serve as a flue. Directly beneath it, she built a hearth from flat stones and a hood from a thick layer of plastered clay, directing the smoke into the fissure. The first fire was a moment of terror and triumph. She lit a small bundle of dry twigs she had gathered from the surface. A plume of smoke rose, hesitated, and then, as if drawn by a giant's breath, it swirled and vanished up into the fissure. It worked. The smoke was being drawn up through the hill, venting somewhere far above, the draft from the well shaft feeding the flames with fresh air. She added more wood. A steady, warm light filled the chamber, the first light it had ever known. The stone hearth and the earthen walls began to absorb the heat, creating a thermal battery that would radiate warmth long after the flames died down. For the first time in weeks, she was not just surviving. She was warm. Her small stock of scavenged food dwindled. She had been living on a handful of dried meat and hard bread she'd brought with her. It was gone. It was time to return to Providence Creek. The journey back felt different. The cold was still brutal, but she was stronger. Her body was a tool she now understood. The town, when she walked into it, seemed smaller, its wooden buildings fragile and exposed. She entered Gable's Mercantile, a ghost returned from the grave. The men by the stove fell silent, their mouths agape. They had all presumed her dead, a frozen tragedy they could speak of with solemn shakes of their heads. But here she was, thinner, harder, her face smudged with dirt, but undeniably alive. "Ilara," Gable stammered. "By God, we thought you were gone." She ignored the stares. She walked to the counter, her worn boots making soft sounds on the floorboards. She reached into a pocket and pulled out a small, heavy bundle tied in cloth. She'd spent her nights whittling, using her husband's knife on pieces of seasoned wood she'd found. She untied the cloth, revealing a dozen small, exquisitely carved birds. Each one was perfect, detailed with a skill that made them seem ready to take flight. "I need to trade," she said simply. Gable picked one up, turning it over in his hands. He was a merchant, but he was also a man who understood craft. He saw the hours, the skill, the artistry. He looked at her hard, calloused hands, and then at the delicate carving. There was a long silence. "What do you need?" he finally asked, his voice quiet. 2 laying hens, a sack of seed potatoes, salt, and another 20 feet of rope. The request was so bizarre, it broke the tension. A ripple of murmurs went through the store. Brant, the hunter, let out a harsh laugh. "What, are you starting a farm down there, Ilara? Going to raise chickens in a hole?" He turned to the others. "I told you she was mad. The well widow, that's what we should call her." The name stuck. It spread through the town like a winter fever, a piece of cruel folklore. The mad widow in the well. But Gable, to his credit, made the trade. He gave her a fair price for the carvings, packing her supplies without another word of judgment. As she left, carrying 2 clucking hens in a crate, he saw not madness, but a will so powerful it defied comprehension. The journey back with the chickens was a new kind of challenge, but she managed it. She had already dug a small alcove for them off her main chamber, a tiny coop with a roosting pole and a heavy, flat stone she could slide into place as a door. The chickens, initially terrified, soon settled in, their soft clucking a strange and welcome sound in the deep silence. They were more than just a source of future food. They were life. They were another heartbeat in her subterranean world. The deep winter closed in, burying the world in a blanket of white. Life, for Alara, shrank to the dimensions of her home. Her world was the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and living creatures. It was the warm, yellow glow of the firelight on the clay walls. It was the sound of Leo's gurgles and cries, the gentle clucking of the hens, and the constant, faint howl of the wind, a distant memory of a world she no longer inhabited. Her days fell into a strict, unchanging routine. Wake in the near darkness, tend the fire, adding precious pieces of wood. Check on the chickens, gathering a precious, still warm egg every other day. Nurse Leo, haul water from the cistern. Work. She was always working. She dug another, smaller chamber for storage. She carved shelves into the clay walls. She planted the seed potatoes in buckets filled with a mixture of dirt and chicken manure. In the dim, indirect light that filtered down the well shaft, they sprouted. Pale, ghostly vines, but they were growing. It was a miracle of green in a world of brown earth and white snow. The nickname the town had given her, the Well Widow, was a constant, unspoken presence. She knew what they were saying in the warmth of the mercantile. They were telling stories of her madness, painting her as a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting a hole in the ground. Silas, she knew, would be encouraging these stories, using them to justify his actions, to erase her from the town's memory. Brant, the trapper, would be adding his own embellishments, boasting of the strange sounds he heard near the well on his trap lines. She endured smaller tests that hardened her systems and her resolve. One week, a thaw followed by a hard freeze caused a sheet of ice to form over her chimney fissure, backing smoke into the chamber. She had to climb to the surface in the biting wind and chip it away, nearly freezing herself in the process. She learned to build a small stone cairn over the vent to prevent it from happening again. Another time, a weasel managed to get down the well shaft, its eyes gleaming in the firelight. It was after the chickens. She killed it with the shovel, her heart pounding, and spent the next day weaving a tighter cover for the wellhead. Each challenge overcome was a lesson learned, a knot tied tighter in the rope of her survival. Then came the storm. The old-timers would later call it the Blizzard of '83, a name spoken with fear and reverence. It was not a storm. It was a war declared by the sky. It began not with snow, but with a cold so profound it felt like the end of the world. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single afternoon. The air grew thick, heavy, and still. Then the wind came, a solid wall of force that hit Providence Creek like a hammer. The snow that followed was not snow. It was a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice particles that scoured wood, shattered glass, and buried the world in minutes. For 3 days it raged, a ceaseless, deafening shriek. The sun vanished. The world became a maelstrom of white noise and unimaginable cold. In Providence Creek, the flimsy confidence of the settlers shattered. The town was built of wood and pride, and both were failing. Roofs, not designed for such weight, began to groan and splinter. The great pine beams of the meeting hall cracked with a sound like pistol shots. Chimneys, caked with ice, failed to draw, filling cabins with blinding, choking smoke. Windows frosted over, then burst inward, letting the storm into the heart of their homes. Livestock, trapped in barns, froze where they stood. People began burning their furniture, their floorboards, their futures, just to stay alive for one more hour. Mr. Gable's Mercantile, the symbol of the town's prosperity, had its north wall buckle under the pressure of a 12-foot drift, the sound of splintering wood lost in the roar of the wind. The community, which had prided itself on its toughness and independence, was collapsing. 30 feet below the fury, Elara's shelter held. The blizzard was a distant, muffled roar, the anger of a forgotten world. The earth that surrounded her was a perfect insulator, impervious to the wind and the catastrophic drop in temperature. Her small fire burned steadily, its smoke drawn cleanly away up the hidden fissure. The thermal mass of the stone and clay held the gentle heat, keeping the chamber cool, but a life-saving 40 degrees warmer than the surface. The chickens clucked softly in their alcove. The water in her cistern did not freeze. Leo slept peacefully in his cradle, a box she had carved from a hollowed log. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. She was the sovereign of a tiny, warm, quiet kingdom, while the world of men was being torn apart above her. On the third day of the blizzard, a new sound broke through the muffled howl of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging, coming from directly above. It was the sound of a fist hammering on the frozen, snow-covered lattice over the wellhead. Then a voice, ripped to shreds by the wind, screamed down into the darkness. "Hello! Is anyone down there? For the love of God, help!" Elara froze, her hand on Leo's cradle. The voice was familiar. She crept to the bottom of the well shaft and looked up. A sliver of gray light showed through a hole that had been punched in the cover. "Who's there?" she called up, her voice echoing in the stone cylinder. "It's Brant," the voice screamed back, raw with panic. "The trapper. My cabin. The roof came down. I'm freezing. I saw steam coming from the rocks up here. I thought I was seeing things." Brant, the man who had laughed at her, the man who had named her the Well Widow. He was dying on her doorstep. She looked at her small, precious stack of firewood, enough for perhaps 2 more weeks. She looked at her dwindling supply of potatoes, at the half-dozen eggs she had saved. She looked at her sleeping son, whose survival depended on those meager resources. Every piece of wood she gave to Brant, every potato, was taken directly from her child. The bitter memory of his mockery, of the town's scorn, rose up in her. It would be justice to leave him to the storm he was so sure she would die in. But then she looked at her own calloused hands, hands that had dug and built and fought for this life. She had not done all this just to become as cruel as the men who had cast her out. She was a mother. She was a creator, not a destroyer. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a statement of who she had become. "The rope is by the old oak," she shouted up the shaft. "Tie it to the trunk and get yourself down." A few minutes later, a heavy shape blotted out the light from above. Brant half fell, half slid down the rope, landing in a heap at the bottom of the well. He was a creature of ice and desperation. His beard was a solid block of frost. His face was a waxy, dead white. He was shaking so violently his teeth chattered like stones in a cup. Elara helped him crawl from the shaft into the warmth of her chamber. The shock on his face was absolute. He stared, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. He saw the steady fire, the smooth clay walls, the neatly stacked firewood. He heard the impossible sound of chickens clucking. He saw the pale green potato vines growing in their buckets. He smelled the air, which was not the fetid stench of a grave, but the clean scent of earth and smoke. Then his eyes fell on Leo, sleeping peacefully, his cheeks pink with warmth. Brant looked from the healthy, thriving child to the impossible home carved from the earth, and the arrogant certainty that had defined his life crumbled into dust. He could not reconcile the woman he had mocked with the architect of this impossible sanctuary. Elara gave him a cup of warm water and a piece of cooked potato. He devoured it like a starving animal. When he could finally speak, his voice was a hoarse whisper. "The town. It's dying, Elara. People are freezing in their homes. Silas, his boy has the fever. Mary sent him to get help, but there's no help to be had. Their farmhouse is on the North Ridge. The wind is hitting them worst of all." The storm broke its siege the next morning, the wind finally dying down to a low moan. The world was silent, buried, and transformed. Elara knew what she had to do. She left Brant, now weak but stable, to watch over Leo. She fashioned a crude sled from planks of scavenged wood. She loaded it with half of her remaining firewood, a blanket, and a small sack containing 6 potatoes and 4 eggs. It felt like giving away her own heart. She wrapped herself against the cold, climbed the rope to the surface, and pushed her way out into a world of blinding white. The landscape was alien. The snow drifted into monstrous shapes, burying fences and erasing roads. The cold was still savage, but she knew the way. She leaned into the harness she had made, her boots sinking deep into the powder, and began the brutal 2-mile haul to Silas's farm. She found the farmhouse half buried in a drift, a single, pathetic thread of smoke rising from its chimney. The windows were opaque with ice. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The scene was one of utter desolation. Silas, Mary, and their young son were huddled together under a pile of blankets in the main room, not 10 feet from a fire that was little more than a pile of glowing embers. The air was frigid. Silas, the man who had cast her out into the storm with such certainty, looked up. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with defeat. He saw her standing in the doorway, a figure wrapped in frost, pulling a sled laden with life, and he broke. A dry, racking sob escaped his lips. It was Mary who spoke, her voice a faint whisper. "Elara, we were wrong. Oh God, we were wrong." Elara looked at them, at the frightened child, at the man who had wronged her so terribly, now broken and helpless. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction. There was only a great, quiet weariness and the simple, pressing need of the moment. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't speak of justice or revenge. Her response was action. "There is wood," she said, her voice clear and steady in the cold room. She untied the logs from the sled. "Build up the fire. The child needs warmth." She said nothing more of the past. She showed Silas how to pack the base of the frozen walls with snow to act as insulation, a trick she had learned from watching the drifts around her own shelter. She handed the potatoes and eggs to Mary. "There is food. Eat." Her grace was in her practicality. She did not offer forgiveness in words, for words were cheap. She offered them life, the one thing they had tried to deny her. When the great thaw finally came, weeks later, and Providence Creek emerged from its white tomb, the story of what Elara had done spread faster than the melting snow. It was a legend told in hushed, awestruck tones. The story of the well widow, the woman who had burrowed into the earth and emerged to save the very people who had scorned her. The community was transformed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling respect. Silas, consumed by a shame he could never escape, tried to give her the deed to the main farm. He came to the well, his head bowed, and offered her the paper. She looked at it, then back at the simple, stone-ringed entrance to her home. "I have a home," she told him, and her refusal was a more damning judgment than any curse. He lost all standing in the town, living out his days as a ghost in his own house. Mr. Gable arrived next, his hat in his hands, his face etched with a new understanding. He offered her a full year's worth of supplies from his store, anything she wanted, free of charge. She accepted only a large bag of salt and a wide variety of seeds. The nickname, the Well Widow, was never again spoken with scorn. It became a title of honor, a name whispered with reverence. Her home became a place of pilgrimage. Settlers from Providence Creek, and eventually from farther afield, came to see the impossible shelter. They came to learn. They saw the ingenious chimney, the clever cistern, the thermal efficiency of living within the earth. The next generation of homes in that valley were different. They were built with deeper stone foundations, with root cellars that were more than just storage, with a newfound respect for the insulating power of the ground itself. Her simple, desperate act of survival had changed the very architecture of the frontier. Years passed. The entrance to the well was eventually framed by a proper door, with stone steps descending into the earth. The underground chambers were expanded, smoothed, and made comfortable. It was a warm, dry, and peaceful home, always cool in the summer and safe in the winter. Ilara would sit at the entrance on summer evenings, watching her son, Leo, play in the long grass. He was a child of the earth, strong and quiet, with his mother's unbreakable will in his eyes. She had not just built a shelter, she had cultivated a life from the most worthless piece of land imaginable. She had proven that strength was not about what you owned or the height of your walls, but about the refusal to be broken and the grace to offer warmth to those who had left you in the cold. Her legacy was not written in books, but in the foundations of the town, a quiet testament to the woman who had found her life not by reaching for the sky, but by digging deep into the earth.